Welcome to the 2015 Birks Lectures. My name is Dan Masiri. I'm Interim Dean for the Faculty of Religious Studies. The annual lecture series was established in 1950 to represent 65 years of tradition here. It was established through the generosity of the late William M. Birks. The lectures are given by distinguished visitors, usually around this time of the year. And the first lecture was the Reverend Leslie Hunter. More recent lectures have included Houston Smith, Northrop Frye, Wilfred Caldwell Smith, Gregory Baum, Urban Mulder, John H. Higg, David Little, Paul Griffiths, Harvey Cox, and more recently, Donald Lopez, Remy Bragg, Jan Osman, David Ferguson, and John Collins. It has a distinguished history. Its origins in the foundational work of the Birks family, probably dating back over 100 years of dedicated commitment to religious and theological education in the Montreal area and beyond. The 2015 Birks lecture will be presented by Professor David Shulman, Professor of Humanistic Studies at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and my colleague, Professor Devesh Sonaji, will be introducing the speaker.
Thank you, and a warm welcome to everyone. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes introducing our speaker today. We're very fortunate that Professor Shulman has come all this way to give us this talk. For me personally, this is a dream that has been sort of spinning in my mind for about 11 years. I'm very happy that we finally managed to bring Professor Shulman here, so thank you very much.
Could you speak louder, please?
Yes, certainly. I'll try to speak into the mic, maybe. Sure. Professor David Shulman is regarded as one of the world's foremost authorities in the languages and literatures of India. He received his PhD in 1976 at the School of Oriental and African Studies, London, in Tamil literature. His research embraces many fields, including the history of religion in South India, Indian poetics, Tamil Islam, Dravidian linguistics, and Carnatic or South Indian music. He is also a published poet in Hebrew, a literary critic, a cultural anthropologist, and a peace activist. He was formerly professor of Indian Studies and Comparative Religion at the Hebrew University, Jerusalem, and professor in the Department of Indian, Iranian, and Armenian Studies, and now holds an appointment as Renee Lang Professor of Humanistic Studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He has authored or co-authored more than 20 books on various subjects, ranging from temple myths and temple poems to essays that cover a wide spectrum of the cultural history of South India. Among these are the monographs Tamil Temple Myths, Sacrifice and Divine Marriage in the South Indian Shaila Tradition, 1980, The King and the Clown in South Indian Myth and Poetry, 1985, The Hungry God, Hindu Tales of Filicide and Devotion, 1993, and most recently, More Than Real, A History of the Imagination in South India, 2012. As well, he has the co-authored works with Virchidhanarayana Rao and Sanjay Subramaniam, Symbols of Substance, 1993, and Textures of Time, Writing History in South India, 2002. Bilingual in Hebrew and English, he works in Sanskrit, Hindi, Tamil, Telugu, and Malayalam, and reads Greek, Russian, French, German, Persian, and Arabic. He has a passion for Carnatic or South Indian classical music, and has also studied Hindustani or North Indian Dhrupada singing. Professor Shulman is actually coming to us from Boston, where he was just elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters. So I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Professor David Shulman.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay.
say I'm very happy, honored to be here for many reasons. You may not know this, but I actually married into Montreal. My wife, Eileen, was here, was born and grew up in Montreal. She's also an alumna of McGill University. So I have a kind of long relationship with Montreal, and that really heightens the sense of happiness and pleasure that I have. I want to thank the people who invited me, Dean Siri and especially Devesh. Devesh is a long-standing friend, and I hope that people in this room are aware that he's also the finest scholar of classical South Indian music, dance, and other art forms in this generation. And it's truly wonderful to be here with you, Devesh. Thank you. So I'm going to be talking tonight about an art form that is called Kuriatam, which literally means acting together or playing together. It's a form of theater, and in fact, as you will have noticed maybe from the title of this lecture, it's the last surviving form of theater in the world in the Sanskrit language, that is to say, the ancient classical language of India. This in itself is a very remarkable thing. You know, for somebody who knows Sanskrit, may have perhaps learned the text of the play that is being performed, to go to Kerala and to hear this play performed on stage in the very particular and rather unusual style that the Kuriatam performers perform Sanskrit. To hear that is actually a very thrilling experience. And because this is a very old and continuous tradition, sometimes I say it'd be as if a classicist working in Greek had happened upon some remote Greek island where there was a continuous surviving tradition of performance going back to the days of Sophocles and Euripides. It's sort of something like that. We have this Kuriatam tradition surviving in Kerala, not by chance in Kerala on the southwest coast, because Kerala has a particular history. In some ways it was somewhat cut off from the other parts of South India, from India generally, by the Western Ghats, a kind of mountain chain. And actually many archaic performance traditions survived only in Kerala, of which Kuriatam is perhaps in many ways the most spectacular. So what I want to do tonight is to give you a kind of very, very short introduction to this tradition. It's a performance tradition of immense complexity and intricacy, and even if I had as many hours as a Kuriatam performance usually takes, that could be anywhere from 12 to 150 hours, I would still not be able to exhaust the things that really one should know in order to begin to understand how this tradition works and how it's put together. So I'm going to be giving you a very brief synoptic introduction. I'll say a few general words, words of a general nature to begin with. I want to show you a few pictures just to give you a sense of where we're located and what what the visual experience of Kuriatam is like. In the rest of the lecture, I'm going to be focusing on the particular unusual structural features of the Kuriatam performance. They're unique in India. And I hope that by the end of the lecture, you'll at least have some sense of what it is that makes a Kuriatam performance what it is. I'll be showing you 2 video clips. Actually, they're by far the most important part of the lecture, much more important than anything I have to say. Kuriatam is something that you have to see, but I'll try to set it up so that you'll be able to get some idea. And then tomorrow, those of you who are inclined to come back for the lecture tomorrow, I'm going to be talking about a specific performance, a long performance, of relatively long, 6 nights, of a play taken from the epic, the Ramayana. I'll be trying to offer I'm hoping to give you some sense of what it actually feels like to see a full-scale Kuriatam performance. So let's begin with a few pictures, okay? Kerala. I want you to see what it looks like. This is what it looks like. It's arguably the most beautiful part of India. Some people would say it's the most beautiful place in the world. The Malayalis live in Kerala. I like to say that they live in God's own country, and I'm inclined to think that they're right about that. It's a very well-watered place, as you can see. Very fertile in all ways, especially in cultural ways. And that's sort of central Kerala, but just to give you a taste of what it looks like in the mountains. So it looks like that. Okay, it's really nice to go to Kerala to see Kudiyatam, and really that's the way to see Kudiyatam. Actually, is to see it in Kerala. Those of you who find this lecture of some interest, warmly invited to invite us next August. We're going to be in Kerala for a performance of 15 nights, and we're going to see things like this. So I'm just going to show you a few pictures without going into details, just to establish something of the atmosphere. So you'll have some sense of what it looks like. I don't know how to do this and also press the. How's that? Is that better? Okay. All right. Okay. So just to give you an impression, these photographs are taken by a very fine photographer whose name is Hashim Harun. Here are the drummers. They play the ancient drum called the mirave. You can just have some impression of the very elaborate, beautiful, colorful costumes. These costumes are color-coded. They have a complex semiotics, which I'm not going to try to explain. But what you will see are the hand movements. You see how the actor is moving his hands, and that's a very critical thing, because actually he's using the language of gesture, hand gesture, abhinaya. It's truly a language. It's a language that one can learn. I would say about 80 to 90% of a Kudiyatam performance is abhinaya. It's that kind of gesture, and I'll tell you more about it in a moment or two. You can see that there are male and female actors. This is Dr. G. Indu, perhaps the finest of the actresses in the Kudiyatam tradition today. I'll tell you more about her in a moment. You can see that she too is moving her hands. Those hand gestures say something. They're connected to the verbal text, as you'll see in the video clips I'll be showing you in a moment. So, you're seeing a rather unusual moment in Kudiyatam because there are two actors on the stage. The standard experience in a Kudiyatam performance is that there's a single actor, and that actor really is an entire world. He constitutes an entire dramatic world which includes various different roles and personae. I'll be explaining that to you in a moment. But the concluding nights of Kudiyatam performance usually have what is called Kudiyatam in the narrow sense of the word. That is to say, more than one actor, two actors or three actors acting together on the stage. That's what you're seeing here. Okay, I think that should do for now. Just to give you some idea. And you'll see more in a few minutes, okay? Let me say, again, just a few very general words of introduction. Something about the name, Kudiyatam, acting together. We're not exactly sure what the name means. It could be that it's a reference to the fact that you have the actors and actresses and the drummers, whom you saw, and they act together in the most marvelous synchronization. It's a kind of incredible thing. It has to be seen to be believed. Of course, they've been trained over many years of acting together. Could be that this is a reference to the fact that you do occasionally have more than one actor on stage at the time. Kuriatam could also, however, mean that there's the merger of two separate traditions, perhaps from a long time ago, centuries ago. There's some reason to think that one of the strands that went into making up this tradition came from the Tamil country to the east, and another strand was a very local Kerala, indigenous one. We think this because there is a reference in early Tamil literature, in a text called the Silapadikaram, to a dancer actor who's called a Sakyan or a Chakyan. So the name is important because the standard actors in Kuriatam for the last 1,000 years or so at least have belonged to a community, caste community called Chakyar. Same name, the Chakyars. This was their traditional art. The male actors came from the Chakyar community. The female actresses came from a related caste community, the Nambiar. The Nambiar also supplied the drummers and the makeup artists, and they have a few other roles. So these two castes together actually bore the tradition over many centuries. And it's possible that the name actually refers to that kind of combination. Both of these castes, the Chakyars and the Nambiars, they lived off of the Kerala temples. And one reason that the tradition survived is because the Kerala temples, the big temples in Kerala, there are many hundreds of them, they were committed to preserving this art. All of the great temples have what is called a kutambalam, that is to say a performance space. Usually it's a kind of stone-carved pavilion near the entrance to the temple, often very beautifully carved. And that is where these Kuriatam dramas were traditionally performed. The link to the temple is so intimate that in fact the god in the temple is very often thought to be the prime spectator of these performances. They are performed above all for the god. Sometimes the actors say that they are performing for the lamp. I think you may have seen in the pictures that there's a kind of lamp with 3 burning wicks. That's also very important, and the actors themselves like to say that they're performing for the lamp. But in traditional times, the god was the chief spectator, and actually he also chose which drama he wanted to see. There was a particular form of divination that allowed the god to tell them which drama was to be performed over the next week or 2 weeks or a month or whatever it was. So this was a temple art, and the Chakyars or the Nambiars were what are called Ambalavasis, that is to say, they lived off of the temple. They had an annual stipend in rice and in kind, and for many generations, that was how the art form survived. Did not depend on the numbers of people watching a performance at any given moment. This was a steady part of the annual temple ritual. That has changed today in Kerala. There are no longer temples that support in any truly regular way Kuriatam. Actually, the temples in Kerala lost many of their assets, most of their lands in the course of the last 50 years. And so now, today, Kuriatam performers have to compete with everybody else in the open marketplace. That means they're competing with Bollywood films and modern theater and all kinds of music and so on. And I can tell you it's not easy for them. I'll tell you more about that in a moment when I tell you how it was that I became attracted to this particular tradition. Okay. So already once or twice in the course of the last couple of minutes I've said that this is an old tradition, or hinted at the fact that it's a very old tradition. The Kuriatam performers themselves are convinced that they are the inheritors of the original ancient Indian dramatic tradition. We have a text, the Natya Shastra, which is the foundational text of Indian drama and dramaturgy, probably from around the 2nd century AD, Sanskrit text. And the Kuriatam performers will always tell you that they have inherited the Natya Shastra tradition, and in some ways they're right about that. That is, there are all kinds of features that belong to the classical form of Indian drama. Indian drama was a major, ancient, powerful tradition with hundreds, possibly thousands of texts, surviving plays. And many features of the tradition that we see in the old book, the Natya Shastra, are indeed still present in Kuriatam. Just to name a few, there's the fact of the hand gestures, that language of Abhinaya that I mentioned earlier. There's the fact that performances are always kind of multimedia and multilingual, that is to say they take place in several languages, in Sanskrit above all, but also in Malayalam, the local language. They include what you might think of as kind of dance movement elements. There's the musical side of the drumming and the sung, chanted verbal text and so on. And even the performance space of the Kutambalam fits very closely with the prescriptions of the Natya Shastra. And I could go on like this, explaining all of the continuities, but I'm not going to do that. Because actually, although it is true that there is an unbroken continuity going back some 2,000 years, it's also the case that Kudiyattam is a highly localized South Indian Kerala tradition, very much linked in certain ways to other kinds of Kerala performance traditions, some of which some of you will know very well, such as Kathakali or the ritual traditions of Mudiyappu and above all Theyyam. Here's a hint for those of you who know something about these names. Tomorrow you'll see something that is somewhat reminiscent of Theyyam, arguably the most powerful visual performance genre in India, perhaps in the world. So this is a Kerala tradition, and in fact it has revised the traditional structure of the Natya Shastra, classical Sanskrit tradition, in ways that I'm going to try to explain to you, okay? So this is a long tradition. It's long in two senses. One, it goes back a long ways. There are, by the way, people who think that Kudiyattam is perhaps the most archaic surviving dramatic tradition in the world. UNESCO declared Kudiyattam to be a great treasure of human civilization, and in their report they claim that this is one of the oldest forms of theater that has survived to the present day. It's certainly very old. We know that it was performed in the style that is performed today for at least the last, say, millennium or so, perhaps 1,000 years. But it's also long because the performances tend to be long by our standards. I'll tell you what that means, just to give you some sense of it. Kudiyattam performances range in length from the shortest one, which is about 12 hours. 12 hours, that means performed over 3 days. That's the shortest one, the Mattavilasam. To the longest one, which is what's called Mantrangam, very archaic play, it goes on for 41 nights, about 150 hours of performance. That means that every night you see maybe 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or sometimes 7 or 8 or 9 hours. And this goes on for however many nights it takes. This is not a trivial thing to say, however many nights it takes. Everything about Kudiyattam is predicated, traditional Kudiyattam, predicated on the notion that however long it takes, that's how long they're going to do it. So if it takes 10 minutes to do that, which means once upon a time, long time ago, I gave you the kind of very accelerated version of it, right? If it takes 10 minutes to do that correctly and to finish the gesture beautifully, they'll do it. They don't cut corners. It's the only thing in my entire life I have seen where there's no rushing to finish. It takes however long it takes. I often think that most of us, myself included, spend our lives kind of rushing madly toward our eventual deaths. We're rushing to do this and that and cutting corners all the time and feeling harried and hassled and pressured and all that. Am I the only one in the room to feel like that? That's, I think, the standard thing. But Kudiyattam is the great therapy to that feeling, because in Kudiyattam there is no rushing. It's a modular art form. They can also collapse a performance of 120 hours or 150 hours into maybe 2 or 3 hours. I've seen them do that. And actually they do it in a very admirable and beautiful way. But in general, it takes time. And the standard performances are usually something like 6, 7, 8, 15 nights. The performance we're going to be seeing next August, again I want to renew my invitation to you, end of August in Kerala, it's going to be a 15-night performance, probably around 60 or 70 hours. The amazing thing about that, there are several amazing things about it. One is that you cannot skip any night. if you want to actually understand a full-scale performance, believe it or not, you have to be present at every single night. Even if it goes on, for example, for the 29 nights of one of the great masterpieces, the drama of the Ring, Angulianga, which we have seen. 29 nights, I mean, I can tell you from experience, you cannot skip a night. I mean, you can have some kind of experience of, if you go to 2 nights or 3 nights or 4 nights, but if you actually want the full effect of it, to see the effect of the aesthetic whole. So, I mean, you can even imagine just from what I've told you now, it kind of builds up to the kind of full climax that is really unimaginable for other art forms. You know, it takes that kind of time. So there's no skipping if you want to see the whole thing. Of course, it is okay to fall asleep from time to time. I do, for sure. They tell you, the Kuriyatam artists, that they're not at all troubled by that. Actually, they say it's rather nice to fall asleep while Kuriyatam is being performed. Say in the early part of the evening, it's good to fall asleep. Then, say around 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, you might wake up. And then you're fresh and ready to see. And then you really, really see what is in front of your eyes. And usually what you see is a very, very remarkable thing. Okay. I want to tell you, so again, this is a long tradition, long historically, and also long in the sense that to see a full performance can take quite a few hours. The other remarkable thing about that is that although, it might seem to us like this is really a kind of very slow performance tradition, I actually do not experience Kuriyatam like that at all. In fact, I think it's rather fast-paced. And that's because that actually every moment of it is so rich in meaning, in movement, in color, in suggestion, in feeling, that you actually, you hardly have time to sit back and say to yourself, my God, this has been going on for the last 3 or 4 hours. And, you don't feel that because you're so gripped by what has happened. I did the first time I went to see a full performance. I'll tell you how that happened in a moment. On the plane, this was going to be the Ashoka Vanigangam, the 5th act of a text called the Ashkarya Chudamani, the Miraculous Jewel, by Kerala poet Shakti Bhadra. So on the plane, I was with my students, and I knew I had about 60 hours of performance before me. I'm not usually very good at sitting through long performances. I don't even like going to religious services that last more than about 10 minutes or so. And so on the plane, I said to myself, what have I got myself into this time? I'm going to be bored out of my mind. How will I survive 60 hours of this kind of drama? But in fact, I wasn't bored for a single moment. So, by now I've seen many hundreds of hours of Kuriyatam. Occasionally, even I do feel slightly bored, but it's certainly not the normal thing at all. And there are moments in a Kuriyatam performance where the main actor may actually move nothing at all except his eyes, his eyeballs. And that could go on for, let us say, 2 or 3 hours. And that might seem to you to be kind of a test of one's endurance, but in fact it's absolutely gripping and compelling in ways that I can hardly describe to you. I said to you earlier that Kuriyatam uses the gesture of a hand movement, abhinaya. Each verse of the text, every word of the text, in its peculiar restructuring, which I'll describe in a moment, will have to be actually spoken again, so to speak, by hands or by the eyes. It so happens that in Kuriyatam, the eye movements are particularly important. It's called netra vinaya. Just to give you an anecdote, so I have some sense of what this means. They can do amazing things with their eyes, these actors. They're trained, of course, over many years. So they can do things with their eyes that most of us will never be able to do unless we actually go and study Kuriyatam for 10 years or 15 years. There's a story about a famous Kuriyatam performer of the previous generation who failed his final exam. Usually after many years of study, let's say 15 to 20 years of study, there would be a final examination after which the actor was then allowed to perform fully on stage. Actually, the trajectory is a little more complicated than that, but there was this kind of final exam. Of course, you studied from some kind of authoritative figure, usually an uncle. This is a matrilineal society, so usually it was your uncle. So one of the great performances of the performers of the previous generation failed his final exam. So the exam took the following form. He went into the room and the teacher performed a sequence, a long sequence of about half an hour, moving only his eyes, and the graduating student had to say what it meant, what he had seen, you know. So it was actually a kind of complicated story. There was a garden. In this garden there was a big tree. The leaves of the tree were falling down. On the branches of the tree there was a swing. There were two girls swinging back and forth on the swing, and so on. Went on like that, various emotional effects. And he expressed all of this with his eyes, the teacher, and the student understood all of it, but he made one critical mistake. He misidentified the tree, and he failed his exam. Okay, so you can see that they can do really remarkable things with their eyes. I just wanted to tell you how I got into this, and then I'll show you the video clip. I was in Kerala in 2006 for a conference. I was living at that time in another part of South India, in Andhra. I flew in to Cochin in order to attend this conference. Kudiyattam performers today often survive by giving little short snippets of performance, maybe 2 hours or 3 hours, at something like that, at a conference, at a family function, or something like that. That's how they survive. So they brought in this woman whom you saw in the pictures, Dr. Indu, and she was performing what's called Nangiyar Kuti. By the way, all of these terms are on your handout, so I'm not going to sort of, you'll have them on the handout. She was performing Nangiyar Kuti, that is the female version of Kudiyattam. She had a single drummer with her, and she performed the text that it's called Kansavadhan, which, she was performing Putana Moksha. This is when the baby Krishna, Lord Krishna, sucks the life out of the demoness who has come to poison him with her milk. So it took her about 2 hours to do that. I can tell you the first hour, I hardly saw what was happening before me. I was still in my mind lost in various things related to Andhra Pradesh and Telugu and the things that I was doing. I just landed at the airport and walked into this performance. And I don't think I saw or understood anything. I'd seen Kudiyattam before, by the way, years before, and liked it, but never truly kind of understood what I was seeing, I think. But the second hour, I somehow woke up. I woke up and I saw this woman doing the most remarkable thing. I thought it was perhaps the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in the world. And I was so struck by it that I went to talk to Dr. Indu after the performance. I was there with colleagues of mine from the Hebrew University, so she invited us to her village. It's a village called Murikulam. It's about 20 kilometers north of Cochin, capital of Kerala. A famous place because there's a temple to the god Lakshmana in this village, and Lakshmana, as it happens, is an aficionado of Kudiyattam. He really likes dance performances, there's no question about it. The Chakyars had settled in this village, this Chakyar community I mentioned earlier. They had settled perhaps some hundreds of years ago in this village of Murikulam, and they have a school there which is called Nepatya. Most of what you're going to see tonight are films taken from the Nepatya troupe, in which Dr. Indu is the prime actress, and the main actor is a man called Margi Madhu, really one of the great actors of our time, I think, even by world standards. We went to visit, she invited us to the village, so we went there the next day, and that was the first time we heard what you could call the Kudiyattam lament. I've since heard it many dozens of times. It goes something like this, they say, here we are, we're highly trained performers. It's true, they're great performers. Some of them are absolutely outstanding performers. They've spent however many years, 15 or 20 years, learning to perform this art. They're trained to give full-scale performances of a length such as I've mentioned just a few moments ago. But they end up these days performing usually these short, little tiny snippets of maybe 2 hours or 2.5 hours or 3 hours. That's really what they do. And they feel that they have no scope actually to present their art in the natural form in which it should be shown. Think about it for a second. It's as if you were listening to the Beethoven violin concerto, and the violinist played the first 2 bars, and that was it. That was all you could hear of the concerto. It's something like that, So I was very touched by this lamentation. And I said to my colleagues, we simply have to find a way to allow these people to once again begin to perform full-scale performances, full-length performances, without cutting any corners, without any compromises. We have to somehow find a way to do it, and also to bring our students to see it and to study this. And I didn't know how to do it. I needed some money because we needed to pay the actors something. Not very much by our standards, for 60 hours of performance, we paid them initially, I believe, something like 2 lakhs, about $5,000, I thought I needed about $10,000, 5,000 for the actors, and 5,000 to bring our advanced Sanskrit students and our beginning Malayalam students to Kerala to see this performance. And not knowing what else to do, I went to the president of the Hebrew University, Professor Menachem Megidor. I'm very happy to mention him here because of what he did. I explained to him what I've just explained to you. He said this is a very ancient classical tradition. Its survival is hanging by a thread. I need $10,000 in order to pay the actors and to take our students there. And you know what? He gave me the money. It was kind of an amazing thing. Sometimes I think it's the kind of thing that might only happen these days at the Hebrew University. Maybe that's not true, but we got the $10,000. That was, he said, the kind of seed money. Indeed, this eventually took the form of various further grants and support. We're now immersed in a project together with the University of Tübingen in Germany, where there's a very fine scholar, Heike Moser Oberlin. She's a Kudiyatan performer, trained performer in her own right, also a scholar of the tradition, with a very fine book about the female version of the Kudiyatan, that is Nangyal Kuti. Together, these two universities, the University and Tübingen, perhaps the only places in the world where Kudiyatan is really studied in a deep way, I think. We've come together on a project which has allowed us to go back every year for the last 7 years to see these full-length performances. So we now have a group of students. I can tell you my Sanskrit and Malayalam students, they've become connoisseurs of Kudiyatan. Some of them can read the Abhinaya perfectly, better than I can, although I've learned some of it by now. And we also developed a kind of, empirically, we developed a mode of watching and learning, which takes the following form. Usually most days we have a preliminary introduction, an introductory lecture to what's going to happen that night in the performance, following the instructions of what is called the Adda Prakaram. These are handwritten notebooks in Malayalam that the performers have in the families that come down to the families. The performers treat them like a kind of sacred text, and that indeed lays out the program for each particular night. That's one way we know that even in ancient times, 1,000 years ago, Kudiyatan was performed in these sequences of 3 or 4 or 5 hours every night until the entire sequence was finished. They take us through that night's performance in the Adda Prakaram in Malayalam. But if you come, I can tell you we'll have plenty of people who can translate for you to explain. That way we were able, actually, from the beginning to understand at least something of what we saw. The first time we went, when we saw this amazing text, the Shokavanikanga, we really didn't know what we were looking at. It was all completely new to us. We couldn't make head or tail of it in some ways, but we were in a state of constant intoxication by the sheer beauty of everything, both the Kerala surroundings and also the amazing things that we were seeing on stage without actually being able to understand very much of what we were seeing. Over time, we've learned a little bit now, and as I say, we now have some connoisseurs who are part of this core group of spectators. Okay. So that's what I've had to say by way of a very general introduction to the tradition. There'll be time for you to ask questions. I'm sure you'll have some questions about it. And I've only touched the very sort of topmost layer of this so far. Now, what we're going to do in the remaining time. How are we doing? Am I okay for time? Yeah? Okay. So I want to describe the structural components of a Kudiyatan performance. There are only 3 such structural elements. So this is really, grade 0 introduction. This is what you need to know in order to understand the way a performance, by a performance I mean a full-scale performance, the way a performance is put together and how it works. First of all, the unit of performance is an individual act. Never the entire play. There is no such thing in Kuriatam. They never perform the entire text. They do a particular act, and the sequencing of that act is also completely jumbled up in ways that are very, very confusing at first. It's a kind of non-linearization of what was originally a linear text. Usually it'll begin with a verse taken from somewhere in the middle of the act. I'm going to show you something of that in just a moment. See it again tomorrow. This verse eventually is expanded in certain ways, leads into what is called the Nirvana. First of all, there's this entry into the stage, which I'm going to show you in a second, the Purapadu, where that verse is sung. It's followed by what's called the Nirvahanam. You have the word on your handout. Nirvahanam is a retrospective in which the main actor, character, takes you through the entire prehistory of the moment that has just begun. And that's followed then by Kuriatam in the narrow sense of the word, that is to say by more than one actor on the stage. Okay? That's the way it goes. But again, I want to say, none of this follows a linear sequence. You have to imagine, for example, suppose you were going to see, well, let's take a real example. Suppose you were going to see Macbeth in the Kuriatam style. I mention this because our group, the Nepatya troupe, they're very open to experimentation. These are actors who know the world, they've traveled the world. So they've actually produced a Kuriatam version of Macbeth. I have a DVD of it at home. So you know what it looks like. They've picked a single verse from Act 3 of Macbeth, at Banquo's feast, those of you may remember this. And out of that single verse, they gradually exfoliate the entire play of Macbeth, including a retrospective part leading backwards towards the beginning, again in a very non-linear fashion, in the course of which everything that goes into the mind of Macbeth, all his wishes, fantasies, desires, memories, whatever is in that mind is slowly exfoliated and exhibited on stage through the Abhinaya, sometimes by quoting verses from the earlier acts of the text, and eventually this produces its final climax, which again I can tell you is of a kind of unimaginable richness and intensity. So that's what a Kuriatam performance is like, okay? The individual act is the unit, okay? Sometimes quoting from other acts, and it has this triple sequence, you have this on your handout, begins with the Purapada, the entrance onto the stage of the chief character, in the course of which two things happen. First of all, he recites a verse, the first verse of the text, but actually he may not really recite all of it. He may recite only the first two lines of the verse. Sometimes, as in what you'll see tomorrow, he doesn't even do that, he just gives a little tiny prose sequence introducing the verse. Sometimes he begins the verse, he then will enact the entire verse in Abhinaya, in his hand movements and eye movements, and then he'll do something else which I'll describe in a moment. The verse will be completed at the end of the Nirvahanam retrospective, which could be 10 nights later. And for those of you here who know Sanskrit, I think you'll know what that means. It means to be sort of left dangling in the air after 2 lines of a 4-line Sanskrit verse for 10 nights, that sets off something in the mind. There's a certain tension. You're waiting all the time to hear the verse completed. And again, it can take a long time until that happens. And when it does happen, there's an experience of kind of profound satisfaction and a kind of coherence or integration or something like that. That usually marks the end of the retrospection and the entrance into Kuriatam and the finale, the culmination of it. So let me go back to the Purapada, the initial sequence, where the actor comes on the stage and performs that first verse or some part of the first verse. Okay, everybody with me so far? So that is then followed by a sequence which looks like a kind of abstract movement dance sequence, in which the actor does all kinds of things. You'll see it in just a minute. He moves back and forth, he goes in every direction. He does all kinds of things with his hands. There are verses being recited by the Nandiyar female accompanist sitting on the side. Actually, what he is doing is creating a world. He's creating an entire universe which has everything in it that a universe should have. As they say in Kuriatam, from the creator God himself, down to the ants. Everything. Trees, flowers, rivers, mountains, everything that lives and breathes, all of this has to be created by this dance sequence and the hand gestures and the eye gestures in a kind of open space. And every time he creates one part of it, you'll see in a moment, he ties it down so that it won't sort of get loose and escape. Because that's the world, that universe, that's the world in which he and the audience and the God, perhaps, are going to live until the performance is over, for however many days or nights it takes. And having reached that point of completion where everything is there, from God down to the ants, everything tied in place, he then plucks invisible flowers. You could say imaginary flowers. That doesn't mean they're not real. They're very, very real, but they're invisible. He plucks these imaginary flowers and offers them as an offering from the actor to the deities and the rest of the creatures which he has just created out of his own art. So I'm going to show you that now. I'll just tell you that at the end of the whole Kuriyatam play, say after 60 hours or however long it takes, at the end of it, that world has to be deconstructed. They have a certain way of doing that. It's very moving to see it. Very moving to see it. They burn a little piece of the equipment that they use on stage. The actor prostrates himself in the direction of the god, who remembers the chief spectator. You can see them actually physically take apart this world in which all of us have been living for the last many days and nights. It's a very moving thing to see. So I'm going to show you the sequence of the Purapadu, a bit of it. I'll show you those imaginary flowers and the offering, okay? Before that, you'll see 2 or 3 minutes in which you'll see the pattern movements in which this world is being created. This is a sequence, by the way, the actor is called Raman Ashan, Kalamandalam Raman Ashan, a very famous Kuriyatam performer, and he's performing in a play called Mattavilasam. Mattavilasam is one of the 2 Kuriyatam pieces in the repertoire, which was actually composed outside of Kerala. It's composed in the Tamil country by a king called Mahendra Varman in the 7th century, and it's a farce. But like every other Kuriyatam text, it's been very radically revised, reconstructed, you could say, in performance. In the end, only 2 verses of this play are performed, and it's performed as what is called Varivada. Varivada means a performance which is in fulfillment of a vow. People who want to have male children patronize, commission a performance of this particular play, Mattavilasam, in order to get male children. It's not by chance that this particular performance that shows here the god Shiva as a kind of madman or a drunkard. I don't know if I should tell you this or not, but actually we saw the whole performance in a place called Kilimangalam in 2011, and within the next 2 to 3 years, 3 of our young Sanskrit students, female students, who were there at this performance, became pregnant and gave birth to male children. So you can decide, what to do with that. Okay? So here's a bit of the Purapada, the entrance into the stage. I'm not going to try to explain the hand gestures here. I don't think you need that. But notice the lamp. There's no performance without the triple flame of the lamp. The actor dressed as Lord Shiva in his form as a kind of drunkard or a madman. See him? That gesture is the gesture of tying things in place. it is again. He's just created another piece of the universe and tied it down so it won't escape. Violated the Kuriata rule of never cutting corners and never compromising. Sorry. Oh, sorry. I went too far. The offering to the gods. And he's prostrating himself in the direction of the god in the temple at Kilimangalam. And this is followed by a very moving moment in which the Shakya performer actually is taken to the shrine of the god, looks at him, faces him, and rings the bell. There's a bell at the entrance to any such shrine. But actually, only Brahmins are usually allowed to ring this bell. But on this moment, that is after the Puttapada introduction to the theater, the Shakya actor is actually able to, he's allowed to ring, he has to actually ring the bell and call the guy. Okay, so that's the Puttapada. Let me say a couple of words about the Nirvahanam, and then I'm going to give you a last little sequence, and I'll stop at that, okay? So again, we have these three parts. There's what you just saw, the entrance onto the stage. It has the features that I've described to you. It's usually followed by a rather long retrospective. So just as I said to you when I was describing Macbeth, let's imagine that you're seeing the Ramayana play, and the main hero, the epic hero Rama, is on stage. Or perhaps his enemy Ravana was a particular favorite of the tradition. So what you will see over a period of some days or nights is Ravana remembering all kinds of things that have happened to him, and all kinds of things that he wished had happened to him, kinds of fantasies and hopes, and all of those kinds of things. You know, it has a particular structure, this Nirvahanam. Here, for one thing, the actor himself appears as a storyteller, and there's a significance to that. That is, he's both himself as the character, but he's also a storyteller. And the way that story is told, again in this kind of non-linear way, very much colored by the nature of the character himself. But within this, the character consistently and repeatedly adopts other roles, other characters, other personae, and he does this, although he's a single actor on stage, he does this by, I don't know if you saw, there's a kind of little funny red-white tassel on his costume. He tucks this tassel into his waistband, there's a particular movement that he makes. This is a signal that he's become someone else. So you have an embedded persona in the story that is being told by the character as storyteller. Sometimes you have double, triple, quadruple embeddedness, that is, characters with who were also embedding various imagined or remembered other characters. And this can achieve effects of actually astonishing complexity. And within all of this, you also have what is called the vistara, a vistara elaboration. So I'm going to show you a piece of that now, this vistara elaboration. This is a very critical thing in Kuriata. Because you see in that world, where the character is being revealed to you in all the complexity and richness of his inner life, in this world there may be little fragments of stories or set pieces that are part of the Kuriatam repertoire that can be enacted in a very elaborate way. So I'm going to show you, and this is going to be the last thing of any consequence that I will be able to say to you today. I'm going to show you a sequence, which I've chosen, first of all, because it's not really very long. There are many possibilities for what to show you, but I thought this one maybe would be good because it's really only about maybe 20 minutes, but I won't show you the whole 20 minutes. We'll kind of skip through pieces of it, but it's immediately comprehensible because in this sequence you don't have any of the embedded characters that I was talking about before. Not only that, the abhinaya, the language of gesture, is very transparent. Actually, it's very close to a kind of mimetic, mime-based sequence. And that's something that happens in Kuriatam from time to time. That is, to truly understand a performance, you have to learn the language of abhinaya and be able to follow what they're doing. But there are sequences, like what I'm going to show you now, where you don't really need it at all. And you'll be able to see, simply by knowing the context, what the actor is doing. Okay, so here, let me just give you the context, and then I'll let you see this, okay? So this is taken from a play called the Subhadra Dhananjaya. It's a carol, a play attributed to a king called Kulashekara Varman, probably an 11th or 12th century play. Actually, the tradition ascribes to this particular king, Kulashekara Varman, the revolution in the structure of the tradition that I've been describing to you. This is the way I think the tradition has of actually saying, taking cognizance of the fact that something very different has happened here. You know, in classical Sanskrit theater, there was a plot, and that plot, according to the Natya Shastra and the later theoreticians of Sanskrit theater, that plot has a certain inevitable structure, like the plot of any play that we might know. It begins with a seed that develops and sprouts and reaches a kind of climax, and eventually this climax produces a resolution. There's a whole series of what are called the Sandhyangas and Arthaprakritis, in which traditional Sanskrit drama is supposed to develop. None of that exists in Kuriatam, and instead what you have is this threefold structure that I've mentioned. And that includes these vistara elaborations. So here we are in this text called the Subhadra Dhananjaya by Kulashekara Varman. It's about the love of the epic hero Arjuna for a young girl who's called Subhadra, happens to be Lord Krishna's sister. So actually these two people have fallen in love, but it's a little problematic because actually neither of them knows the true identity of the person that they've fallen in love with, and each of them thinks that he or she is in love with somebody else, who actually we know as the audience is indeed this same person, but the characters don't know. In any case, Arjuna is in love with this young girl Subhadra. And he has, this is one of the Kuriatam dramas where there's a clown figure, Vidushaka, who speaks in Malayalam, and his job is usually to puncture the romantic illusion of the hero, just like in classical Sanskrit drama. So at one point, this clown says to Arjuna, he says, why are you so completely obsessed with this young girl Subhadra? Why her? Arjuna has actually already been married to several hundred other women, so why, here's another, why is he so concerned, so obsessed with this particular girl? And so you have the verse on your handout. Let's just look at it for a second. Here's what Arjuna answers the clown, explaining his newfound passion. So I'll read it first in Sanskrit, let's sing it, and then we'll read it in English. He says, Sangaryam sukumarata madhurata kantir mano harita shrimatta mahineti sauva vivabha nisheshanari gunam etasyam upayujyatur vidataya dina paramatma bhu srashtum vanshiti chet karotu punarapi atraiva bhikshatam. Actually, a beautiful verse, which is, for those of you who know, in this text, the Kavya Darsha of Dandin, this is a verse which actually takes off from that classical text. What he says is a list of outstanding female qualities: loveliness, delicacy, sweetness, luminosity, charm, brilliance, and good lineage. These sum up the best and most necessary features of a woman. So far it's kind of conventional statement. Now comes the point. God, he says, lavished them all on this one girl. If he ever wants to make another woman, he'll have to go begging from her. So what you're going to see is the actor has now assumed the role of God, Brahma, the creator God. And he's in the business of creating this young girl, Subhadra. And he has, as you'll see in a moment, he has little kind of pots or jars that have all of these virtues: luminosity, charm, brilliance, all, they're little pots, and he's taking little bits of the pots and sort of dabbing them on Subhadra, who's in the process of being created, right? And you'll see him working at this like any sculptor or actor, but actually as time goes on, I'm not going to be able to show you the full sequence, but as time goes on, I'll show you the end of it, he sort of loses it, you could say, God. And he begins to just, lavish whatever he's got. He empties the pots and the jars on Subhadra until he reaches a point where the jars are empty. He would like to give her even more luminosity or charm or whatever, but the pots are empty. You'll see that moment. And the result of all of that is that he himself soon realizes that whenever he next has to create another beautiful woman, and let's remember that this is what he does every day. He's always creating beautiful women. I mean, he does it again and again and again and again. Whenever he's going to do that, he's going to have to go to Subhadra as a beggar and ask for just a little bit of luminosity. So if you have time, I'll show you how he does this. Okay? This is Marty Madhu performing as God. Happy with the way it's going, but it's not finished, as you can see. I hope you're able to see the beautiful woman that is being created here. Kudyatam is all about that. It's about seeing what is normally invisible. It's being created before your eyes in empty space. Okay, I'm going to advance it a little bit with the apology. Counting the various elements that he has together, right? The luminosity, the radiance, the charm. That's the Abhinaya gesture for beauty. So now he's taking a little bit of something, beauty I guess, from one of his jars, and plastering it on Subhadra. But now he's kind of losing control. Let's see. More and more, emptying the jars. He's completely lost control, as you can see. And he's also beginning to notice that he may be running out of, charm, good lineage, beauty. Empty. No charm left in the world. It's kind of a heart-rending moment for God. this heartrending moment, I'm going to have to stop. If we had time, I would show you how Brahma, the creator god, actually comes as a beggar to Subhadra repeatedly, over and over again, in order to ask for just a few crumbs of charm and luminosity and so on. But I think I've spoken long enough. I hope it gives you at least some idea of what this amazing tradition is about. Thanks very much.
So I think we have about 10, 15 minutes for questions.
Could you tell us a little bit about the tradition of commentary, where it's on this, it's so old. I'm sure there's a tradition of either oral or reflection.
Okay, so I mean that's a very important question. Here's a tradition which has never been theorized at all. It's as if, think of Greek tragedy without an Aristotle or something like that. Not that I believe that the theory in itself is always such a wonderful thing, but still the fact is that we don't have any internal theory of what the aesthetic aim, one might say, of a Kudiyatam performance is meant to be. What we do have are fragmentary sources. For example, you have the oral tradition of the actors themselves. They, in many ways, are the best commentators on what they're doing, and they often have very amazing things to say about what the play is about and what they're doing and why they're doing it and all the things related to that. And we have the Akta Prakaram, and there's another kind of source book which is called the Kramadipika stage manuals. They give you some clue sometimes to some kind of internal perspective or theory, you might say, of how a Kudiyatam performance is supposed to work. But there's no really full-fledged, well actually there's nothing even like a full-fledged theory. Now, there is, however, one very important and unusual text. It's a text probably from the 15th or maybe even early 16th century. It's called the Natankusha. That is to say, the elephant goad of the actor. It's a hostile title, and the book, in fact, was written apparently by some kind of very sort of puritanical, fussy Brahmin, probably from a place, a Buddhist Brahmin, probably from a place called Payur, which was a kind of a bastion of these conservative, mostly grammarian, grammatical scholars. This is a Sanskrit tract which is hostile to Kudiyatam. And the fascinating thing about it takes the form, like any Sanskrit theoretical work, takes the form of an internal debate, an imagined opponent, and then the Siddhantin person who offers what is, he thinks the definitive opinion. So the fascinating thing about this book is that here the author himself is saying again and again to his imagined opponent, he says, why can't you just perform the play the way everybody else does, You have the play, you have the text, you have a certain plot, why don't you just perform the play, Please do that. Give up all this crazy thing of, all these kind of imagined internal characters and characteristics and this jumbling of the sequence, the memory and the future projections, the Buddha Padu, just as I showed you. Forget it. He says, why don't you just do what the Sanskrit drama always did, So that's a very precious piece of evidence because it shows you that at the time of the author of the Tankusha, we have Kudiyatam more or less as we have it today. The same kinds of things. Not only that, this puritanical, fussy Brahmin had, I think, as a reader of the text, a secret love for Kudiyatam. He actually liked what he saw, but he couldn't somehow cognitively make sense of it in terms of what he thought was the tradition and how the tradition was meant to be performed. But the result was that he gave his Chakyar opponent, the opponent is definitely a Chakyar actor, he gave him by far the best arguments. So if you want to know what the Chakyar of the, say, late 15th century thought about what he was doing and why he was doing it, you actually have it in the form of the opponent, the imagined and rejected opponent of the Tankusha. And that opponent says some very, very remarkable things. So I don't really have time to go into it, but there's a number of things that I could tell you about what seems to be the idea behind this restructuring of the classical theater. Yes, please.
Thank you for a very moving talk. Is there anything in the performance tradition which allows for improvisation or audience participation. Also, are the Chakyar, are they part of the priestly Sudra or the artisanal?
Okay, they're Ambalavasis. That means they're temple servants. So they occupy the particular slab in the whole, rich caste world of medieval Kerala, which goes with these servant communities. They're servants of the god in the temple. They're not artisans. Their own tradition, like many such communities, is that they were once Brahmins and that they fell from this Brahminical status. Now, that's undoubtedly untrue. Even though, interestingly enough, today, if for whatever reason a Nambudiri Brahmin is outcasted, let's say, he falls in love with a, unsuitable bride or whatever it is, such cases have been documented. These people tend to be taken in by the Chakyar community. So there is a kind of very interesting pattern, social, historical pattern of that sort. But you asked, is there room for improvisation? That's again a very important element. The actors, although they're bound by the Attaprakaram handbooks, and they regard them as authoritative texts, despite that, they will tell you that Kudiyattam is the art form which offers the actor the most freedom of any known art, dramatic art in the world. That's what they think. There's plenty of room for improvisation. Of course, it takes certain pattern forms. But this kind of vistara elaboration that I was showing you, that's a very standard and normal thing. As I said earlier, this is a modular form, so they can improvise. Sometimes they can take a single word. In this verse that I showed you, there is a little word, a particle, api, which any Sanskritist who reads the verse, without thinking too much about it, is going to think it's just a kind of empty filler. They take that little word and they give it about an hour's elaboration, and they actually show you that that word is absolutely necessary. It's so striking, the sort of commentary by improvisation, that actually I myself feel we need a new theory of textuality to explain this kind of artistic form. And it would be a form of textuality in which that commentary, let's call it that, actually precedes the written text that it supposedly comments upon, which is not the standard model of what's called the Western or Mediterranean kind of text, So there's plenty of room for improvisation. At the same time, they can collapse a very long sequence into a few minutes. Yes, please.
Hi. Can we say, in a perhaps a very loose sense, that this is something like the theater of the absurd? It's when I watch this, it's as if we were watching Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. Do you think it's something like that? It's the abstract, the non-linear, that is there, something like that? Again, I'm speaking very loose sense.
I don't think it's really very much like the theater of the absurd. Actually, it sometimes looks to a sort of first-time or second-time spectator as if it were something like that. I understand, why it might seem like that to you, but I don't think it's like that. I think this is a theater which is constructed in order to provide very specific kinds of effects, which I could, spell out for you if there were time, just to give you some sense of where it's going. See, this is really, they themselves will say, this is the theater of the mind, and it's set up in order to allow you as the spectator to see into the mind of the character, and at the same time, you as the spectator are, how should I say, you're in a sense deeply committed as a spectator to a kind of very active, imaginative enterprise of your own. Kudiyattam is a theater in which the spectator's imagination merges with the imagination of the actor, and if one might even say so, with the imagination of the character in some sense, although I would have to explain that at greater length if I have time. So it offers you that. It offers you a kind of way of seeing. I call it deep seeing. And there are certain features that go along with this particular kind of deep seeing. You could say, as I said earlier, that it allows you to see things that are not actually visible to the ordinary eye. but that may have the reality, let us say, of a god who is built and constructed on stage and made present, even though you can see him only in the gestures of the actors, and such effects. You know. And that's the way it's kind of rather different, I think, from the theatre of the absurd. You know. Yeah, please.
You mentioned something about the length of the performance, the modularity, some of the features that you outlined reminded me of the epic tradition, both in the epic tradition in South Asia. Could you tell us something more about the Kudiyattam tradition, how it relates to the epic as it's performed, the ideas of digression, modularity?
Yeah. The main texts, all of them are drawn from the two major epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata. In some Kerala reworking. So, you know, there's of course a link to the epic narratives and the epic themes. That's not all there is there. There's also all kinds of other materials that go into it, but there is an intimate link with both of the epics as they were reworked in Kerala. It's important to notice, actually, that all of the plays, with the exception of the Matta Vilasa, which I mentioned earlier, and also the Nagananda, which is a classical Sanskrit play from North India, supposedly, but it's about Kerala and a Kerala girl, and called Malayavati. With the exception of these two works, we're dealing with texts that were all composed in Kerala on what you could call epic themes. That includes, this is for the Sanskritists, that includes the so-called Bhasa texts. So let me just say that about 100 years ago, there was a major manuscript discovery in Kerala of a set of 13 plays that were Sanskrit plays, single-act plays that were ascribed to the ancient poet Bhasa, all of them on epic themes taken from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, mostly Mahabharata. So, you know, since then, over the last 100 years, there's been a raging dispute among scholars as to whether, in fact, these plays were indeed composed by the ancient poet Bhasa, who's mentioned by Kalidasa in the 4th century, or whether there are some local Kerala plays that were just retrospectively ascribed to Bhasa. So, I mean, I have an opinion about this for what it's worth. If you're interested, I'm sure that none of these plays were composed by Bhasa, the ancient poet Bhasa. These are Kerala productions that were composed for performance in the Kudiyattam mode. And there are many ways that actually you can prove that thesis. I think to say nothing of the fact that the Bhasa thesis, I think anyway, has been discredited by a scholar called Herman Tika. But you were asking about the epic mode of performance, right? Yes. So, yeah, you could say that there is a relation there. Of course there is, because, I mean, if you look especially Mahabharata, the epic, you know, it's structured in these kinds of non-linear ways. There is a kind of linear narrative that kind of holds it together in some sense, but there are these constant recursive structures. It's a recursive text. In that sense, Kudiyattam fits that kind of model, I think you might say. You know, it's a particular kind of variant of the epic notion of these deeply embedded recursive structures. Yeah.
We probably have time for one